Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I am the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual program, Sacred Rebellion, a behind-the-scenes conversation with curator Tricia Peone. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, as well as our digital archive, which has more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and exhibitions and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. I hope you'll check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. We are so pleased this spring to be offering a new in-person exhibition, Sacred Rebellion, Congregationalists in Revolutionary Massachusetts. This exhibition highlights the stories of Massachusetts Congregationalists drawn from the CLA's important collections. By the time the American Revolution began, many Congregationalists had embraced a theological justification for war and revolution. They believed that God favored them and that their cause was morally justified, that it was actually a sacred rebellion. But consensus was elusive, and implementation proved difficult and unsatisfactory to many, especially those on the margins. These discussions shaped the legacy of Congregationalism and the way the Revolutionary War is remembered today, 250 years later. This exhibition would not have been possible without the generous support of the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism through their Massachusetts 250 initiative. We're so grateful. And now, without further ado, please allow me to introduce our speaker today. Tricia Peone is Project Director of New England's Hidden Histories at the Congregational Library and Archives. She previously worked at Historic New England, where she was a research scholar for the Recovering New England's Voices project. She's also worked as a university lecturer, teaching classes on the Salem witchcraft trials, early New England, and public history, as well as being a researcher for cultural heritage organizations. Her scholarship focuses on early modern magic and witchcraft, and her work on these subjects has appeared in journals, books, blogs, and on radio and television, and podcasts. Don't forget those. Tricia holds a PhD in history from the University of New Hampshire with a specialization in early modern Atlantic world and the history of science. Tricia, thank you so much for jumping in and curating this exhibition. I want everyone to know that Tricia had just finished curating an online exhibition, Religion of Revolution, and I think you might have curated this in one of the fastest times we could have asked you to do. So, but folks, you signed up to hear Tricia talk about this, not me, so I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kyle. So as Kyle said, this was our first big in-person exhibition here at the Congregational Library and Archives. And the exhibition developed from an effort here at the CLA to better understand our collections and our history. So this image up right now, many of you might recognize it if you've ever visited us, or if you've looked on our website at some photos of the library. This is our beautiful and historic reading room, which has remained basically as it appears there for more than 120 years since the library in its current form in this building at 14 Beacon was constructed in the 1890s. And so the library itself was founded even earlier than that. It was founded in 1853. And since then, it has collected and preserved church records, sermons, and other materials that tell the stories of Congregationalists. But these are materials that tell the stories more broadly of New England and New England history, which is wonderful for me because that is my favorite subject. The original collection housed in the library was only 56 items that were donated by 8 donors. And today the collection contains over 225,000 items. And when it was first created, the CLA was created as a library for ministers, and a lot of the early donors and the early librarians and managers of the library were all congregational ministers. And because of that, the library has a pretty extensive collection of sermons. And sermons can be of interest for a variety of reasons, and I hope to show you today some of the reasons why they can tell us a bit more about social history than we might expect. Our collection of sermons at the library, though, got over 15,000 sermons in our collection, and a smaller portion of those are manuscript sermons, so sermons that were never published or were written and survived that way in manuscript form. And the bulk of those manuscript sermons are from the 18th century. So print sermons from the Revolution are pretty famous. Many of them have been reprinted and published in books and used by historians of religion and of the American Revolution to understand this period. But one of the really special things we have at the Congregational Library is this cache of manuscript sermons that we've recently digitized. They're available on the New England Hidden Histories website, and you can find them online. We'll include some links if you'd like to read some of these delightful sermons that we'll hear about today. So what these sermons do is when we take them together with some of the diaries and letters and notebooks that we have, we can start to get a picture of how New Englanders and Congregationalists in particular in New England were responding to the American Revolution. So we're trying to shed some new light on what the experiences were. And as far as we know, this in-person exhibition combined with our digital exhibition from last year, Religion of Revolution, are some of the first really to focus on exhibitions focusing on materials that show how Congregationalists in particular were experiencing and driving the American Revolution. So as you can probably imagine, one of the best parts of working at the Congregational Library and Archives is the opportunity to spend time exploring our stacks, these beautiful historic stacks full of materials, looking through all of the books, looking through all of the manuscripts that we have. Here are some of our manuscript boxes. The image on the right is where we keep flat files, larger prints, maps, things like that. And that is where I will tell you later found a very important and exciting item that is on display in the exhibition. So what I got to do in preparation for the exhibit as the curator was to spend hours and hours roaming around in the library and archives, researching and looking for things. And what I found, surprisingly, were some treasures that had not been cataloged and probably had not been looked at for many, many decades. And that's a very exciting thing, as demonstrated by my very happy and excited smiling face there, holding on to a lottery ticket from 1776. Because, as Kyle mentioned, we got that wonderful grant from Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism, we were able to put together an amazing team, both with our staff at the Congregational Library, but also with some contractors who helped us. The exhibition was, some of the graphics for the exhibition, as you can see here, this is some of our planning process for thinking about what it might look like, what images we wanted to take out from some of our historic materials to see brought to life in the actual room where the exhibition takes place. And so the graphics for the exhibition were created for us by Barb Barnett. And then the space was transformed. As we said, this was our first exhibition here at the Congregational Library. If you visited, you might have noticed this little space, a little room right off of our reading room when you walk into the lobby. And so with this grant, we were able to really transform that space. And you can see here what some of that process was like. So our exhibition was designed and built by Joy Feasley, Shan Ross, and Scott Curry. And they built some beautiful custom cases for us. We painted the walls. It was quite a lot of work to transform this room into what it is now, which is a really beautiful exhibition space. You can see some of that ongoing work in these images. What a delight to think about the way we would contain and display some of these treasures that we've been holding on to at the Congregational Library so that people could actually see them. So as we were thinking about what should be included and thinking about, the importance of commemorating the 250th anniversary of the outbreak of the Revolutionary War and the way that we understand and interpret this history, we realized that this is a really important moment in our history. This is a time when many people are thinking about what was the significance of the American Revolution? What was the significance of the war? people sometimes disagree about what the war was fought over and what it meant to people and what the ongoing legacy of the American Revolution is. And so what we've done in this exhibition is try to offer a perspective that is complicated, that tells a story through the words and the actions of Congregationalists in New England themselves, the way that they thought about the principles behind the war, and then the way that they started to shape how the war would be remembered and how the public would perceive the legacy. And it's kind of an interesting question because we know that there's kind of a pretty standard narrative of how we interpret the American Revolution. And this is evident in all sorts of things. But one way is through some of the sermons that were printed during and after the war. The way Congregationalists were choosing to remember the war was that it was divinely ordained, that it was a sacred rebellion, which is where we've taken the name of the exhibition, that it was morally justified, that God was on the side of New England because New Englanders were largely Congregationalists, right? So 20 years after the war ends, Boston has an annual 4th of July oration every year. And in 1796, 20 years after the war, the speaker, who was the son of a Boston minister, John Lathrop Jr., he stated, "It is now acknowledged as fact that liberty descended from heaven on the 4th of July, 1776. So he's advocating for a perspective where there's a divine intervention in the Declaration of Independence, right? And so that's a very prevailing narrative. I've probably encountered it before. And it's this idea that there were patriot preachers, that liberty triumphs in the American Revolution, that success against the British was inevitable. But that's that narrative that is long dominated in public memory and in American history scholarship is one that can be confronted a little bit and challenged by some of the objects in stories in our exhibition. So even though many Congregationalists did think that God was on their side and that the Revolutionary War was a sacred rebellion, they debated it. They reflected on what their moral obligations to each other were. They debated questions of liberty. They debated questions of loyalty. And consensus on these issues was difficult to come by. So they were very complicated issues. They had trouble reaching a consensus. And at the end of the war, many questions were left unanswered. And so one of the major themes of the exhibition and what we want to show here is that there was a tension between the idea of liberty and the reality of it for many Congregationalists and many in New England, including women, including indentured servants, including enslaved people, including indigenous nations, religious minorities, and loyalists. So this was a time when this rhetoric of the revolution was ubiquitous, and yet many people were asking themselves, freedom for whom? What does independence look like? What does that mean to be independent? And how could we actually implement these ideas that we're talking about of liberty and equality? One of the other major themes that runs through the exhibition is slavery in Massachusetts. So we've got stories of women challenging the status quo, women who are advocating for rights, stories of ministers confronting their congregations on the issue of slavery. And we're also looking at some of the ways that these questions were left unanswered, right? They become part of the story, but they're left unfinished. It's unfinished business. Things are left undone after the revolution. So we start here in this first small case that you can see in this picture. And we start with the stories of Benjamin Franklin and Jonathan Mayhew. So everyone knows Benjamin Franklin, I think, for the most part. But what we've got that's quite interesting and special at the Congregational Library is the collections of church records from Old South Church in Boston, where Benjamin Franklin was baptized in 1706. His parents and the monument to his parents are buried right outside of the Congregational Library. If you look out the windows in the reading room, you'll see them in the granary. So we start with Benjamin Franklin and Jonathan Mayhew, two pretty famous figures in the American Revolution from Boston. Mayhew was a minister in Boston. He gives this sermon, and that's the sermon that you can see in this display case next to Benjamin Franklin's baptism record. And this sermon is a discourse concerning unlimited submission and non-resistance to the higher powers. And this is a sermon Mayhew gives at the West Church in Boston. he gives a theological justification for resistance to authority under certain conditions. So this is in 1750. This is long before war breaks out, but he's arguing that obedience to authority is the duty of everyone, of all Christians, but that tyrannical rulers, as he's arguing that 100 years ago, King Charles I had been, that they should be opposed. And this sermon was inspirational to many. John Adams recalled that he had heard Mayhew preach once, and he sent a copy of this sermon later on to Thomas Jefferson. It was sort of the ideological origins of some of the patriots involved in the revolution, and it was delivered at the West Church in 1750. So our collections are telling us that we have these stories of very famous people, famous ministers like Mayhew, famous Bostonians like Benjamin Franklin, although he did become much more famous after he moved to Philadelphia. And yet we also have stories of people from Boston who never became famous. And so what we have here is a page of writing written by a woman named Mary Counts. And Mary Counts wrote about her experiences in Boston living during the American Revolution, and her papers ended up in the collection of her daughter and came to the Congregational Library. We have her letters, we have a diary and some of her sermon notes from about the 1750s through the period of the American Revolution. And her letters during the war describe how she survived in Boston for nearly a year during the siege of Boston in 1775. Towards the end of the siege, she writes about seeing cartloads of dead men in Charlestown. She goes on to describe what it was like when her and her mother and another woman tried to protect their house and property from British soldiers. And she said that she was able to drive the soldiers away and keep them out of the house because she said, quote, "I had courage, faith, and resolution. I feared not men nor devils. I had such a sense of the Lord's host encamping around me and the particular mercies he had shown me before." So what comes out of her letters is we get this sense of how she views her life during the war as a religious experience. She sees it as a test. She writes about some of the conflicts that were happening that she observes. She meets a young man who tells her that Old South Meeting House is a house of sedition. She confidently tells him that even though the British have been using it as stables for their horses, right? They took over Old South, took over the building and were using it as stables. She says that she's confident that she will hear the gospel of Christ preached there again. So she knows that the British are going to have to evacuate Boston. She's confident of it. And she says this man who was a loyalist ends up fleeing, and she stays in Boston. So she writes about experiencing the war through this religious lens. She believes that she is divinely preserved from harm. And yet she's someone who most people will never have heard of, right? She's a new story that we can tell at the Congregational Library because we have these pretty remarkable materials. She also wrote a poem about the Boston Massacre, surprisingly, in her papers. And you can see that too if you come to visit the exhibition. But you can also view it online because we've digitized it and it's in our New England's Hidden Histories digital archive. So back to those manuscript sermons I was talking about. They're so exciting because they give us a view that we might not have. Now, when sermons were published in the 18th century, it was often because a minister was famous or he gave a particularly riveting sermon, right, on a special occasion. But what we have is quite a few sermons that maybe didn't make it to publication, right? But because of that, they give us an idea of what people were more likely to hear on a regular Sunday in New England during the war. So we can learn a lot, both from print and manuscript sermons. But our collections show, some of the ways that ministers in particular were shaping the war. And not every one of these sermons is patriotic. Not every one of these sermons, even when they're happening, as this one is happening, it's on the repeal of the Stamp Act. So a significant time in the building of tensions in the 1760s in Boston and New England in particular. But this is a sermon celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act as a victory. And it's given by Joseph Bean, who is the minister in Wrentham, rural Wrentham, Massachusetts. And this is a Thanksgiving sermon. So this is an occasional sermon to celebrate the fact that the Stamp Act has been repealed. Bean is kind of an interesting guy because he'd had an earlier career in business, and then he heard the evangelical preacher George Whitefield, and decided that he should become a minister himself. He was so inspired by Whitefield's preaching. And so he became the minister in Rentham, and he stayed there for 30 years. And he uses in this sermon, he uses the story of Abraham's sacrifice of his son, which he calls a very melancholy story, in order to explain the repeal of the Stamp Act. So he describes the Stamp Act being repealed as, quote, the interposition of divine providence in our favor. And he says, this is the late removal of our burdens and fears and the repeal of the Stamp Act, which has been so grievous to these American colonies. And one of the beautiful things about interacting with these manuscript sermons is you can see that he's also thrown in, he's sort of handwritten on a note attached, he's then stitched it in on a smaller sheet into the pamphlet. In his hand, he copied out a few lines by Isaac Watts from hymn 129, which is also about Abraham and his son. And if you can't read it, it says, just in the last distressing hour, the Lord displays delivering power. The mount of danger is the place where we shall see surprising grace. So I think the materiality of these is interesting to consider too. You know, you can see the way he's written, the way he uses his ink. We can think about all of the ways that he's constructed this text and then reconstructed it and stitched in extra things. He concludes this sermon, though, with a reminder that even though he wants to celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act and we must enjoy our civil liberties, he says, let us not be unmindful of that blessed freedom and liberty our Savior has purchased for his people, a freedom from hell, bondage, sin, and Satan. So don't get too carried away with liberty. And his final thought, though, is that although we can petition the sovereign for a redress of grievances, right, petition the king and parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, and we're successful, says it must always be done humbly and with a heart full of loyalty. So he's warning his audience against outright rebellion. He's encouraging caution in this sermon. We've also got materials in the exhibition and in our collections from Phyllis Wheatley Peters. And if you're not familiar with Phyllis Wheatley Peters, she's a famous African-American poet from the 18th century. She was the first woman of African descent in North America to publish a book, and she wrote a book of 39 poems. This portrait of her is taken from the frontispiece of that book. There's a copy of the book on display in the exhibition. And the poetry she wrote while she was enslaved in Boston. And her poems helped to shape the way that people would understand the revolution as a struggle for freedom. So she expresses themes of piety and themes of liberty. In a letter she wrote in 1774, she wrote, in every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. And she also sends one of her poems to George Washington when war breaks out in 1775. And she sends him a poem and she reminds him that he's fighting for freedom's cause, she tells him. And then in a later poem during the war in 1778, she asks Americans to consider whether God would favor them, would continue to show them favor in the war, while many among them remained enslaved. So she's specifically drawing a connection between freedom and the idea of freedom and liberty and slavery, which is a reality in the colonies at that time. And she's connecting it to the fate of the war and also to religion and morality, right? And so what we've got on the right here is her admission, also from the Old South Church records, in which she was admitted to Old South. So we have a couple copies actually of her book of poems, and we also have this record that documents her admission to Old South Church. So she was certainly writing about slavery in her poetry and asking Americans to think about it as a moral issue and a crisis. Congregational ministers also enslaved people at this time, but some, like Samuel Hopkins, pictured here, and there's a portrait of him in our reading room, were also beginning to ask themselves, what does it mean to be a minister and to enslave someone who is in your household and to enslave someone who's also a member of your church? Congregational ministers in the 18th century were often gifted enslaved people as part of their salary by congregations, by their churches. And it was fairly customary for enslaved members of a minister's household to be baptized, and also eventually, if where possible, to to be admitted as members of the church. And so Hopkins asks himself this question, and he eventually comes to believe that slavery is what he calls a national sin in the American Revolution. And so this book on the right from our library is a copy of his dialogue concerning the slavery of the Africans, showing it to be the duty and interest of the American states to emancipate all their African slaves. So in 1776, this Congregational minister, who had been the minister in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and later in Newport, Rhode Island, when he writes this, he's writing to the Congress and he's telling them that slavery should be ended now in 1776. So many of you familiar with American history will know that slavery is not ended in the United States until 1865 with the end of the Civil War. And yet here is someone advocating for that, certainly much earlier. And so you can see this copy of this important text in the exhibition, along with some other famous anti-slavery ministers in their materials from this period. Another one on the far right, that book that's sort of leaning up, is a copy of Samuel Cook's 1770, so even earlier. And this is Reverend Samuel Cook's Boston election sermon. And he was one of the first congregational ministers to argue in print that slavery should be ended, and he does that in 1770. He addresses the legislature, the general court, and he says that the patrons of liberty have dishonored the Christian name, but he hopes that Massachusetts will lead the cause of the oppressed. So some fascinating origins before we get into the actual war itself. So one of those threads that's kind of weaving through this exhibition is this this language of rights and the way that liberty in a religious sense is being advocated. Here we have one of the treasures that was in the Congregational Library, and it was in those flat files that I showed a picture of. And it's this broadside, and pulling this out of a drawer, I think I might have done a little scream, when I first saw it, because upon first inspection in the stacks, I could not tell necessarily the date of this broadside. So I did a little research, and I got our librarian, our wonderful librarian, Megan Wright, to help identify this. And so when I first looked it up, I saw that there are a couple copies, a couple of different versions of this broadside. One is from 1775, and the other is a 1850 reprint. Now, if we had had the 1775 broadside in our collection, that would have been something. What we do have, in fact, that Megan was able to identify is an 1850 reprint, but it's still a remarkable piece. There were some slight variations in the print, but we've got it framed, and here it is. And this is really just an amazing story of things that, it was not in our catalog, so that we essentially didn't know that where we had it, right, in the library. It is now in the catalog. Megan has cataloged it for us to bring attention to this pretty remarkable document, which is just graphically, right? Those are 40 coffins at the top in that header, graphically documenting the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And it lists the names of the people who died on that day from Massachusetts. One of my other favorite finds was this little lottery ticket. So this is a tiny little lottery ticket from 1776. It's the very first ever United States lottery. Lotteries had been used in British colonies to fund public works. Massachusetts had lotteries prior to the 1770s, sometimes used to pay off public debts. It wasn't a new invention in 1776. But it was kind of an innovative way to try to fund a war, right, through selling lottery tickets. So about 400,000 tickets were sold. They had different prize amounts. Ours is a first-class ticket, which means it costs $10 and would come with a prize if you won of $10,000. So $10 for your chance to win $10,000 and support the patriot cause. Most of the tickets that were printed didn't actually sell, and they didn't even draw the winners until 1778. But we had it in one of our folders here at the library. And what's interesting about it is it's a little piece of ephemera. I've blown it up a bit here, but it's maybe, a little more than an inch high and 3 or 4 inches long. So it's quite small, and it's very fragile. And yet it was beautifully printed and it survived. And it survived in our library. What does this have to do with Congregationalism, you might ask yourself? Well, it's possible that this ticket was owned by a Congregationalist minister in Roxbury, but the connection between lotteries and Congregationalists, there's usually a lot more of a negative association. One of the things we have quite a number of sermons about is anti-lottery sermons. Lotteries being considered fairly sinful in the late 18th and 19th century by many Congregationalist ministers. Now, that theme I mentioned of complicating the stories of patriot preachers in the American Revolution, we found some really fine examples of ways in which that story is complicated. And so these three pieces here on display in the exhibition are all examples of how congregations responded when their ministers were suspected of being loyalists. So they responded rather dramatically, actually, and sometimes with a threat of violence. So these stories, the one on the left is some records of the Marlborough Association. It's telling us the story of Reverend Aaron Smith, who in 1777 told this association that the windows in his study were shot out at midnight by his parishioners who aimed to take away his life. He had been the minister in his community in Marlborough, Massachusetts for about 30 years, but there were rumors that he held loyalist sympathies. He ended up leaving his ministry because of it. In the middle is a sermon by Reverend Abraham Hill in Shutesbury. He, when the war broke out, was discouraging men from joining the army, and that drew the anger of many in his community. As a result of his hostility to the war and to the patriot cause, he was banned from preaching. His congregation banned him from preaching. He was placed under house arrest. They called an ecclesiastical council to dismiss him when he refused to leave without a fight. And then on the right is a letter written by 3 members of the congregation in Lancaster, Massachusetts, a letter of complaint against their minister, Reverend Timothy Harrington. So he was suspected of being a loyalist and being sympathetic to Catholics. In this letter, the members of the church say that they've left the congregation, they've withdrawn because they complained that his conduct is, quote, grossly contrary to God's word. They accused him of speaking evil of our civil rulers, Congress, and they said that he was subversive of good order. They also said that he was preaching and speaking and discouraging men from joining the army. And then they also found that he was friendly with Catholics and supported the Quebec Act. And so because of that, they had withdrawn themselves from his congregation. They wanted him to be dismissed, but no action was taken against him. He'd also been investigated by the Committee of Safety in Lancaster, but they did not find the kind of evidence that they needed or wanted, and he remained the minister until his death. So he did not leave his community, but there was certainly some hard feelings over his political views. Another item in the exhibition that's certainly another one of my favorites is a manuscript music book created by a young woman from Connecticut who moved to Byfield, Massachusetts. It's got 70 songs copied into it, written by a young woman named Abigail Cleveland. She, when she moved to Byfield and joined the church, she married the son of a minister, and then one of her sons also became a congregational minister. Her selection of songs, and this page here is a song about Bunker Hill, about the Battle of Bunker Hill. She's collected both religious songs influenced by her evangelical faith, but also patriotic songs influenced by the war. Her brother, her father, and her husband all served in the Continental Army. The songs she includes are really interesting to take a look at. This song on Bunker Hill, at the end, it ends with the lines, "Life for my country and the cause of freedom is but a trifle for a worm to part with." So it was a fairly popular patriotic tune about battle, going into battle to face the King of Terrors. And then we come to a couple of other sources, one that I think people probably have heard of and another that you may not have. On the left is a page from the autobiography of Timothy Dickinson. He signed up to join the war and enlisted when he was 16 years old. He wrote, quote, "The only motive I had in enlisting was to serve my country. and get money to support me at school, which my father told me would be appropriated for that use. So when the war ends, he's able to use his military pay for an education. He attends Dartmouth, and 4 years later is ordained as the minister at the First Congregational Church in Holliston, Massachusetts, and remained the minister there until he died in 1813. So a fascinating firsthand account of a young man's journey in the army, and then he eventually becomes a minister, which is why we have this autobiography. And then on the right is the front page from the Female Review, The Life of Deborah Sampson. So this is a pretty famous story. Many people have probably heard the story of Deborah Sampson, who dressed in men's clothes, took the name Robert Shirtliff, and served in battle and saw action during the war. Sampson enlisted about the age of 21. She had been an indentured servant in the household of a congregational deacon and had been raised in the Congregational church, but she later left the church and joined the Baptists, although the Baptists then excommunicated her. But she did receive an honorable discharge from the army, even after it was discovered that she had lied to join, and that she was a female soldier, as the title of the book points out. There are many different interpretations of Sampson's story, and you can read about Sampson's life. Alfred Young has a biography of her, and you can also read another interpretation in Jen Mannion's book, Female Husbands. But the one thing that we can say, I think more or less for certain, is that both, and it's true in the 18th century and in the 21st century, is that her story is a story of someone being celebrated for gender nonconformity, right? That the fascination that people found in her story in the late 18th and early 19th century is probably a bit different, in the way we would talk about it and interpret it is different from today. But she was celebrated for having both the qualities of, as they would describe it at the time, qualities of a man and the qualities of a woman. And she was lauded for many years, and people continue to publish her story and talk about the fact that she was able to pass as a man and serve in the army and fought bravely in battle, and received a pension from the Continental Army for her service. When we move towards the end of the exhibition, we start to find the ways in which the war is being memorialized, and how people are talking about what the war means. And they're talking about it in books, and they're talking about it in sermons. They're memorializing it. Ministers started giving sermons during the war on anniversaries to mark important battles. So you can see there's a sermon from 1782, which is being preached on the anniversary of the Battle of Lexington. The mood of a lot of these sermons towards the end of the war is triumphant. That sermon with the lovely marbled paper cover is by Phillips Payson, and he was minister at the Congregational Church in Chelsea. And he argues that the revolution should be remembered by Congregationalists as a wonder, as providential, that it was God's will. Other sermons, Nathan Fisk wrote a sermon and oration. He's from Brookfield, Massachusetts, celebrating the victory at Yorktown in 1781. And he told his congregation that the British lost, and that would be universally considered as the frown of heaven and a just punishment for her cruel and unrighteous attempts upon America. So they're interpreting the war as, and the fact that Americans win, as a victory that was divinely ordained, that it was in fact a sacred rebellion, and that Americans have triumphed. And that's the view in sermons, but we've also got some books showing other interpretations of the war, how to interpret what happened, how to interpret the legacy, and not everyone agreed. In the middle is a book written by British nonconformist minister Richard Price. He expressed optimism about the future of the new United States, but he also argued that until the US abolishes slavery, quote, it will not appear they deserve the liberty for which they have been contending. And then the book on the right, the first by a first historian by a woman, Mercy Otis Warren, and she writes also a positive but kind of a critical assessment. She also thought slavery was inconsistent with the values that the war was fought for, and she criticized the adoption of the Constitution without a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. John Adams, they were friends, and yet John Adams offered a withering critique of her book, writing in a letter to one of his friends. He wrote regarding Warren's book that, quote, history is not the province of the ladies. these 3 volumes nevertheless contain many facts worthy of preservation. So she had got some things right, but he did not agree with her interpretation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So these are some of the ways that Americans are still thinking and debating and talking about the war. One of the other topics that we wanted to address in thinking about the legacy of the war is the way that Massachusetts comes to really sort of set themselves back in what seems to be the promise of some of the rhetoric of the revolution. And so these are a couple of pages from the missionary journal of Gideon Hawley, who is a missionary what is now Cape Cod, a missionary to the Mashpee Wampanoag, and his diaries show what the impact of the war was on the Mashpee Wampanoag. And so he, on the left is a petition that he writes to the government of Massachusetts describing some of the sort of land grabs that white settlers were making against Mashpee Wampanoag land, trying to take advantage of the fact that the war had caused some chaos, and so white settlers were moving in and stealing their land. And then on the right is a list of deaths of Mashpee who died during the years of the war, and some were civilians who died of fever, consumption, but it's also documenting the military service of several Mashpee men who died serving in the Continental Army. But what happens in 1789, and some of what Hawley's talking about in his petition, is the fact that in 1789, Massachusetts revoked the ability of the Mashpee Wampanoag to govern themselves. So self-government, autonomy, in the ways that Massachusetts had spoken about those ideas against the British, they're now applying that to the Mashpee to say that they'll be put under a system of guardianship, that they do not have the right to represent or govern themselves. So Massachusetts, you can see quite clearly what a contradiction that is to the aims of the revolution. And then lastly, the exhibition ends with this discussion of slavery and the fact that it's not abolished with the revolution, but we can see some of these seeds, right? People of African descent in Massachusetts were petitioning the government before, during, and after the war for their freedom. They also wrote poems and essays like we saw with Phillis Wheatley, and literally were fighting for their freedom for Massachusetts during the war. And then 76 years later, we've got this speech delivered by Frederick Douglass. So he's reflecting on that legacy. He's familiar with the role of African Americans in the American Revolution. He's familiar with these works and this religious explanation of why slavery is wrong that we saw with Phillis Wheatley and with Samuel Hopkins. And he's asked to give a speech in Rochester, New York, to a white audience, and he asks them to consider what to the American slave is the 4th of July. And so he's asking and calling out churches and ministers who are continuing to support and defend slavery 76 years after the American Revolution. And what we have on display in our exhibition is a first edition copy that was purchased by the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in Franklin, Massachusetts, of his speech. So and this was found fairly recently, again, uncatalogued in our collection, but in a collection of pamphlets by an intern at the Congregational Library earlier in the year. And so this beautiful first edition with an interesting provenance, because it was kept by an anti-slavery society, is on view in the exhibition as well. So that triumphant view of the war that we're seeing from some ministers about it being God's will and divinely ordained kind of contrasts, right, with Frederick Douglass still needing to call out ministers and churches for being complicit in slavery nearly 100 years after the war started. So we've got really quite a complicated story in these objects, telling the story of Congregationalists and how many different perspectives really are involved. So we've got Congregationalists who changed their mind about slavery, Congregationalists who were enslaved themselves, and they're telling these stories alongside these more patriotic and triumphant, sort of the traditional narrative of ministers. So it's showing us too how Congregationalists wanted to be remembered, the kind of future they envisioned for themselves, the legacies they envisioned for themselves. And I think overall, the message that we can take from this is that it was certainly a complicated legacy. They recognized that at the time. But in many ways, it was a legacy that was promising a future where there would be justice and compassion, and eventually perhaps liberty, for more and more people through these conversations that they were having, both in print and in person in their churches.
That's a pretty, I think, striking image that you have, that you chose as the signature image for the exhibition, and maybe one that a lot of people haven't seen before. Can you talk a little bit about the process of how do you figure out how to kind of make this branding for the exhibit?
So this image comes from a beautiful almanac that is on display in the exhibition, and it is the cover of an almanac, printed in Boston, and it's from a larger image called The Death of a Virtuous Patriot. And the image shows this angel up in the sort of clouds, but in a bedroom. So the angel is descending from heaven to visit the bedside death of a virtuous patriot, who's this man in his bed and he's dying. He's got his family around him. There's also a congregational minister surrounding his bed, and then this angel. So the reflection, or sort of the, I think the meaning we could interpret from that image is one of, the rewards of being a virtuous patriot, of serving your country, are perhaps an abbreviated journey through life and a faster road to heaven, where you'll be welcomed by, non-binary angels from the sky, coming down through the clouds and smiling upon you. And so I think it was a beautiful image to choose because it is a happy little face, right? And it reflects this view of many Congregationalists, that the war was God's will, and that it was providential, that they're being favored by God and all will be welcomed by angels.
And one of the real challenges is that many of the images that we associate with the American Revolution are so kind of saturated already, right, in our culture. They're on the covers of books, or they're going to be on other people's exhibitions. So, I feel like you also had that kind of challenge of finding something fresh, right? Bringing out something that will maybe make people stop and think. Well, we've got time for questions from our audience, and they're starting to roll in. I've got 1,000 questions for you, but I'm not going to take up all the time with my questions. So great question here from Helen Gelinas, the director of transcription for NEHH. Helen asked, is there any explanation for why those Congregationalists who opposed slavery after the Revolution did not organize or form separate congregations? Is there any connection between that anti-slavery ideology, between those with anti-slavery ideology turning to universalism that became so prevalent after the American Revolution?
I think there probably is a connection, but I also think that because most of New England kind of some immediately, but mostly gradually abolished slavery, that the issue seemed perhaps less critical to many white Congregationalists, and that you could see in the work of Richard Bowles the ways that Black Congregationalists in the early 19th century moved to start forming some of their own churches. And so I think but then you get another generation, by the 1830s and 1840s and 1850s, you have another generation of Congregationalists who will become very agitated anti-slavery activists again. So I think I think you're right, there is sort of a lull after the Revolution, but it certainly doesn't go away from Congregationalist churches. And I think, I think that we could certainly find evidence of non-universalists, Congregationalists who did continue that anti-slavery ideology in their churches.
And remind me, I think Chris Cameron is working right now on Black Universalists in the generation immediately following. So I think there'll probably be some really fascinating work coming out of that.
Yes, and we'll hopefully get him to come back and do a talk when that book comes out.
Absolutely. Um, Great question here from an anonymous attendee who writes, the more I research the New England, the more I realize it's just really one big village. What were some of the surprising connections that you discovered in creating this exhibition?
I think one of the amazing things is, I love to do a little genealogy every now and then, not for myself, but for the people that I am reading about at work. And so, we had our Timothy Dickinson, who we just saw up there. Kyle, you discovered that he has a famous descendant.
Yep. His great granddaughter or great grandniece is Emily Dickinson, another fantastic Congregationalist from Amherst, Massachusetts.
And Abigail Cleveland, who was from Connecticut but moves to Byfield. She married into the family of the famous separatist minister John Cleveland of Ipswich. So she moves from Connecticut. They were cousins. They were all related, same Cleveland family, but Connecticut and Massachusetts. But nonetheless, so she ends up through her marriage writing herself into this whole other history of separatists in that controversial church in Ipswich in the 18th century. So a lot of really fascinating connections, even when New Englanders do move around and move to other places.
Well, another fascinating question here. What is the role of an archive in commemorating the American Revolution?
I think the role of an archive is to figure out, and this is what we try to do with this exhibit, what do we have that tells a story that another institution isn't going to tell or doesn't have the materials to tell a story? And as the Congregational Library, our materials are they connect as we saw. We've got material about Ben Franklin, right? We've got material about these famous revolutionary figures and the Adamses. But we can also tell these stories of lesser known Congregationalists that most people probably haven't heard of. And so I think the role of archives is in telling the story and thinking about the American Revolution is to interpret the material they have in the way that makes the most sense for them and in a way that is hopefully shedding light on stories that are less familiar. This isn't this isn't the 1976 bicentennial. This is a new chapter in American history, certainly a confusing time, but a time when the way we interpret the revolution is just as important as it was in 1976 or 1776.
Isn't that so right that the focus is on making certain that the primary source materials, right, the original voices of those who were firsthand witnesses and many of them participants in the war is available for anyone to come in and see and really kind of interpret for themselves. That you've provided kind of a curatorial gloss over this. Remind me how many you're limited to what, 40 words, 70 words in the exhibition, that there's so many more research opportunities, right? There's so much more opportunity for people to really engage and discuss these objects.
Yeah, there really is. And so if you come in and see the exhibition, you'll see Kyle and I co-wrote this together, the labels that you'll read in the exhibition, but you'll see we had to be very concise. And so some of the stories that I've told today are stories that aren't on those labels. There's 20 more things I wish I could tell you about Abigail Cleveland or about Deborah Sampson. So that is really the trick, is that, and a lot of these materials are digitized. They're either, many of the published works are digitized and available in places like Internet Archive. But the manuscript materials we've digitized, and they're available through NEHH, so anyone can read them and find out more.
So maybe a final question for today. How is it different to curate an in-person exhibition as opposed to an online exhibition, right? Which you've done, immediately before creating it.
They're both fun and challenging in their own ways and rewarding in different ways. I think an in-person exhibition is fun because you get to think about things that I didn't get to think about. So our archivist at the CLA, one of our archivists, Zachary Bodner, he did the design for our digital exhibition. Now, for our in-person exhibition, I got to think about color choices and exciting things that we can't do with the platform that we have for our digital exhibitions when we're doing these things online. But in person, we get to think about the fact that all of our materials are really the same shade of beige, right? They're it's you know, it's not visually as interesting as you might hope, although people like Kyle and I certainly could stare at books and manuscripts and the written word for, I don't know, 50 years, forever, right? But most people coming to see an exhibition maybe want a little more than just words on a page. And so we try to do that through, you know, through adding some interesting imagery, through adding some interesting color to make it visually interesting and not just informational to deliver that content.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this behind the scenes look. I think we've learned that it's much more complicated than maybe many of us imagined to create an exhibition like this. Well, thank you all so much, and we'll see you at the next virtual program.